The fog came in thick that morning, rolling through the pine valleys of western Montana like something alive, something searching. It swallowed the tops of the tallest trees first, then crept lower, filling the spaces between the trunks until the entire forest seemed to breathe in gray. Elena Mercer stood at the edge of a jagged cliff, motionless, her boots inches from where the rock dropped away into nothing. The wind pressed against her jacket. Her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot caught the cold air and loosened strand by strand. In her left hand she held a photograph, small, creased at the corners, soft from being held too many times. A little girl with bright eyes and a missing front tooth laughing at something just outside the frame. Wren. Elena's fingers tightened around the photo. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She had memorized every detail long ago, the way soldiers memorize maps of terrain they may never walk again. Beside her, a large German shepherd sat perfectly still. His ears were raised. His dark eyes watched the fog with an alertness that went beyond training, beyond instinct. The dog's name was Coda, and for the past 3 years he had been the only living thing that kept Elena Mercer anchored to the world. She exhaled slowly. The mist swallowed the sound. For a long time neither of them moved. This was their ritual. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, before the silence of the cabin became too loud to bear, Elena and Coda hiked into the wilderness. They followed the same trails, climbed the same ridge lines, crossed the same frozen streams. The routine was simple. The routine was survival, because without it, the mornings had a way of stretching into something unbearable, and the thoughts that lived in the quiet had a way of growing teeth. Elena Mercer had served as a Navy SEAL for nearly 15 years. Most people, when they heard that, tilted their heads slightly, recalculated something behind their eyes. A woman, a SEAL. The questions always came next, some spoken, most not. She had learned to ignore them the way she had learned to ignore pain by deciding it didn't matter. She had been one of the first women to complete the full SEAL qualification pipeline. Not the first to attempt it. Many had tried, but Elena had finished. She had earned her trident not because the standards were lowered, but because she had refused to break when everything inside her wanted to. The instructors didn't care about her gender. They cared about whether she could carry a 200-pound man through freezing surf at 3 in the morning, and she could. They cared about whether she could make a decision under fire that kept her team alive, and she did. For years she did. The need to serve had come from her father. Garrett Mercer had been a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. He deployed to the Persian Gulf in 1991, came home with a Bronze Star, and a silence that never fully lifted. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't need to. Elena saw it in the way he checked the locks 3 times before bed, the way he sat with his back to the wall in every restaurant, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence and stared at something only he could see. But Garrett Mercer had also been the kind of man who woke up before dawn to make breakfast for his daughter, the kind of man who taught her to read a compass before she could ride a bicycle. The kind of man who, when she told him at 17 that she wanted to enlist, looked at her for a long time and then said quietly that he had never been more proud or more afraid in his life. He died on a Tuesday in November 5 years ago. Elena had been overseas at the time. Classified location, no communication allowed. By the time the message reached her through official channels, Garrett Mercer had already been in the ground for 3 days. She never got to say goodbye. She never got to hold his hand. She never got to tell him that everything she had become, every mission she had survived, every door she had walked through, It had all started with him. That absence had carved a hole in her chest that nothing had been able to fill. After her father's death, something shifted inside Elena. The focus that had carried her through 15 years of service began to crack. Not all at once. Slowly, the way ice fractures beneath the surface before anyone can see it. She started sleeping less. Her reactions during training became a fraction slower, just enough for her team leader to notice. She began pulling away from her unit, eating alone, running alone, standing in empty hallways at 2 in the morning, staring at the wall. The military has a word for what was happening to her. Several words, in fact. Post-traumatic stress disorder, adjustment disorder, complicated grief. The terms filled her medical file like entries in a dictionary, precise and clinical, and completely inadequate for describing what it actually felt like to carry the weight of the dead inside your chest every single day. She was honorably discharged 22 months ago. The transition back to civilian life was supposed to be a relief. That's what they told her. You've done your service. You've earned this. Go home. Rest. But the world she returned to felt like a foreign country. The grocery stores were too bright. The conversations were too small. People complained about traffic and weather and Wi-Fi signals, and Elena sat among them feeling like a ghost who had accidentally wandered into the wrong afterlife. Her marriage hadn't survived. She and Kyle had been together for 6 years, married for 4. He was a good man, patient, steady, the kind of man who left notes on the kitchen counter and remembered anniversaries. But patience has limits, and Kyle had reached his long before Elena came home. He had spent years waiting for a woman who was always somewhere else, always on the other side of a phone call that might never come. When she finally returned, she was someone he didn't recognize. Closed off, unreachable, waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The divorce was quiet, no shouting, no accusations, just 2 people sitting across from each other at a kitchen table, realizing that the distance between them had become permanent. Kyle's older sister, a woman named Deborah, who lived in Billings, had tried to stay in Elena's life after the divorce. She called every few weeks, left careful voicemails, sent short messages that never pushed too hard. Deborah had always liked Elena. She understood better than Kyle did that what Elena was carrying wasn't something a person could simply put down. But Elena rarely answered. She let the calls go to voicemail, read the messages, and told herself she'd respond later. Later never came. But Ren. Ren was the part that nearly destroyed her. The custody hearing had been brief and devastating. Kyle's lawyer presented evidence of Elena's psychological evaluations, documented episodes, missed appointments, an incident report from a VA therapist who noted that Elena had described in a moment of unguarded honesty, feeling disconnected from daily life to the point where she sometimes forgot what day it was. The judge awarded primary custody to Kyle. Elena received visitation rights every other weekend, supervised at first, then unsupervised when she demonstrated stability. She attended the first 3 visits, drove 4 hours each way to sit in a park with her daughter and pretend that everything was fine, that the noise of other children playing didn't make her flinch, that the sound of a car backfiring in the parking lot didn't send her heart rate through the roof. Ren was 7, then old enough to sense something was wrong, but too young to understand it. She had looked up at Elena with those bright, searching eyes and asked why Mommy was shaking. Elena had smiled and said she was just cold. After that, the visits became harder. Not because of Ren, but because of what Elena saw in her own reflection on the drive home each time. A woman falling apart. A mother who couldn't hold herself together long enough to sit on a park bench with her own child. The shame was worse than any wound she had ever received in combat. She missed the fourth visit, then the fifth, then the sixth. Each time she told herself she would go next time. Next time she would be better. Next time she would be the mother Ren deserved. Next time never came. She moved to Montana 3 months after the last missed visit, found a small cabin at the edge of the national forest miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud in the rain. The isolation was the point. No neighbors asking questions. No sounds except wind and water and the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of snow. Just Elena and Coda and the mountains and the kind of silence that felt more honest than anything the world had to offer. Coda had been assigned to her unit during her final year of active service, a military working dog trained for detection and patrol. His file listed him as a transfer from a civilian program found wandering near a highway in Montana after a severe winter storm. No identification, no prior owner on record. The military had taken him in, trained him, and given him a new name and a new purpose. From the first day, something about Coda had been different. He wasn't just obedient, he was attuned. He seemed to understand Elena's moods before she understood them herself, pressing close when the darkness crept in, nudging her hand when she sat too still for too long. In the field, he had been fearless, but off duty, he had a gentleness that surprised everyone who met him. He would rest his head on her knee during briefings and watch her face with those deep brown eyes, as if he were reading a language no one else could see. When Elena left the service, she filed the paperwork to adopt him. It was the one decision in her entire transition that felt right. Now, standing on the cliff edge in the cold Montana morning, Elena tucked the photograph of Ren back into her jacket pocket. The fog was thickening. The world beyond the cliff had disappeared, entirely swallowed in white. She turned to head back down the trail. That was when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. Service out here was unreliable at best, and the only calls she ever received were automated reminders from the VA or occasional attempts from Deborah to reconnect. But something made her pull the phone from her pocket and glance at the screen. A voicemail from a number she recognized, her attorney. She pressed play and held the phone to her ear. The attorney's voice was calm, professional, carefully measured the way lawyers speak when they are delivering news they know will land like a blow. Kyle had filed a motion to terminate her visitation rights entirely. The grounds were abandonment of parental responsibility, 3 consecutive missed visits without communication or explanation. Under Montana family law, the court could grant the motion within 10 days if no formal objection was filed. 10 days. Elena lowered the phone. She stared at the fog. 10 days to respond. 10 days to prove she was still a mother. 10 days to convince a judge that the woman who couldn't even drive to a park deserved to remain in her daughter's life. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered against the rock. She didn't pick it up. She just stood there breathing, feeling the familiar weight settle over her chest like a stone slab being laid across a grave. Coda pressed against her leg. A low whine escaped his throat. Elena closed her eyes. She should call back. She should fight. She should do something. But the part of her that knew how to fight, the part that had carried her through 15 years of combat and training, and impossible odds that part felt unreachable, now buried under layers of grief and guilt and exhaustion so deep it had become indistinguishable from who she was. She picked up the phone, turned it off, slid it back into her pocket, and then she started walking. The trail was familiar. She had walked it hundreds of times. Down from the ridge through the stand of old-growth pine along the creek bed that wound south toward her cabin. Coda always stayed close, usually just a few feet ahead, checking back every few minutes to make sure she was still following. But this morning, Coda did not follow the trail. At the point where the path curved south, the dog stopped. His ears rotated forward. His body went rigid, every muscle locked in a posture Elena recognized instantly. It was the same stance he took in the field when he detected something. Not a casual alert, a deep one, something primal. Then he turned north, away from the trail, away from the cabin, toward a stretch of rocky terrain that climbed steeply into the higher elevations, a section Elena had never explored because there was nothing there. No paths, no markers, just loose stone and dense undergrowth, and the kind of vertical terrain that discouraged even experienced hikers. Elena frowned. Coda, here. The dog didn't move. His eyes were locked on something in the distance, something hidden beyond the rocks and the foam and the dense wall of forest above. Coda, come. Nothing, not even a flick of his ear. In 3 years, Coda had never once disobeyed a direct command. He was military trained. Recall was hardwired into him. When Elena said come, he came. When she said stay, he stayed. It was the foundation of their bond built on discipline and trust and thousands of hours of shared experience. But now, standing on the trail in the gray morning light, the dog simply refused. He looked back at her once, just once, and in that look, Elena saw something she couldn't explain. Not defiance, not distraction, something closer to urgency, as if the dog were saying with every fiber of his being that she needed to follow him, that what lay ahead mattered more than the routine, more than the trail, more than the safe, predictable path back to the cabin where nothing ever changed. Then Coda turned and began climbing. Elena stood alone on the trail, watching him move upward through the rocks with a certainty that made her chest tighten. She thought about calling again. She thought about turning back. She thought about the cabin, the cold stove, the silent phone sitting on the counter, the letter from her attorney that would require an answer she didn't know how to give. And then she thought about the fact that 10 days from now, she might lose the right to see her daughter's face. What was waiting for her back at that cabin? What had ever been waiting for her there except more silence and more mornings? Exactly like this one, Elena stepped off the trail. The terrain changed immediately. The gentle slope gave way to loose shale and jagged outcroppings. She climbed carefully, using her hands to steady herself against the rock, her boots searching for solid ground with each step. The fog grew thicker as she ascended, wrapping around her like wet cotton, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet. Coda moved ahead with a confidence that unsettled her. He navigated the rocks as if he had traveled this path before, choosing footholds with an ease that suggested memory rather than instinct. His pace was steady but urgent, and every time Elena fell behind, he stopped and waited, watching her with those dark, patient eyes until she caught up. They climbed for nearly 30 minutes. The world below disappeared entirely. The forest sounds faded. Even the wind seemed to thin, replaced by a stillness so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. And then they reached the top of a narrow ridge and Elena stopped. Below them on the far side of a deep canyon, half hidden by fog and towering pines, sat a small wooden cabin. Smoke curled from its chimney in a thin gray line. Elena stared. The cabin looked old, decades old, maybe more. The wood was dark and weathered, the kind of aging that comes only from years of mountain winters. The roof was covered in moss. The windows were small, barely more than slits in the walls. A crooked fence surrounded a tiny garden, and even from this distance, Elena could see that the garden had been tended recently. Green things growing in neat rows. Someone's careful work. None of this should have been here. Elena knew these mountains. She had studied the topographical maps. She had hiked every marked trail within a 20-mile radius of her cabin and several unmarked ones. There were no structures in this canyon, no access roads, no records of any kind. The land was federal wilderness, protected and empty. Yet there it was, a cabin, with smoke rising from the chimney, which meant someone was inside. Her SEAL training surfaced immediately, quiet and automatic. She assessed the terrain, the sight lines, the potential approaches. She noted the single visible door, the absence of vehicles, the narrowness of the canyon that would make any approach slow and exposed. Every instinct she had developed over 15 years told her to be cautious, to observe, to gather information before making a move. But Coda was already moving. The dog had found a narrow path descending into the canyon, a thread of packed earth winding between the rocks that looked like it had been carved by decades of rain and foot traffic. He started down without hesitation, his body low, his movements deliberate, as if every step were pulling him towards something he had been searching for longer than Elena could understand. Elena watched him disappear into the fog below the ridgeline. She stood alone on the rock, the cold pressing against her face, the photograph of Ren, a small weight against her chest inside her jacket pocket. She could turn back. She could return to the cabin, pick up the phone call, the attorney, begin the process of fighting for something she wasn't sure she deserved. Or she could follow the dog. The decision shouldn't have been difficult. In any rational calculation, turning back was the right choice, the safe choice, the responsible choice. But Elena Mercer had spent 22 months making the safe choice. She had chosen isolation over connection, silence over honesty, the certainty of solitude over the terrifying uncertainty of letting someone see who she had become. And where had those safe choices led her? To a cliff edge in the fog, holding a photograph of a daughter who was being erased from her life. She looked down into the canyon one more time. The cabin sat in the mist like a ghost of something that shouldn't exist. The smoke rose and vanished, and somewhere below, Coda was waiting. Elena adjusted her jacket, tightened her bootlaces, and began the descent. The loose stones shifted under her weight immediately. She moved slowly, bracing against the rock face, testing each foothold before committing. The fog closed in above her, sealing off the ridge, and within minutes the world shrank to a narrow column of gray and stone and the sound of her own breathing. Halfway down, her left boot hit a patch of wet shale. Her foot slipped. For one terrible second, her body tilted over the void, and she saw the canyon floor far below, a thin silver ribbon of creek cutting through dark rock. Her fingers clawed at the stone. Her heart slammed. Then she felt it. Teeth, gentle but firm, closing around the sleeve of her jacket. Coda. He had circled back. He was braced against the rock above her. His powerful legs locked his jaw, gripping the fabric of her coat, pulling her back towards solid ground. For a moment, they hung there together, woman and dog balanced on the edge. Then Elena found her footing. She pressed herself against the rock and breathed. Coda released her sleeve and looked at her. His tail moved once, a single slow wag. Then he turned and continued down the path. Elena followed. It took nearly another 30 minutes to reach the bottom. The canyon floor was dark and quiet, sheltered from the wind. A shallow stream ran through the center, cold and clear, moving over smooth stones with a sound like whispered conversation. The trees here were enormous ancient pines whose trunks were wider than Elena's arm, spanned their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so dense it blocked most of the remaining light. Coda crossed the stream without pausing. Elena waded through the icy water, biting at her ankles, and climbed the opposite bank. The cabin was close now. She could smell the wood smoke. She could see the details she had missed from the ridge. The garden was more extensive than she had thought, rows of root vegetables and herbs growing in dark soil. A small wood pile stood neatly stacked against the cabin's east wall. An axe leaned against a stump nearby. A pair of worn boots sat on the porch steps, toes pointing outward the way a person leaves them when they plan to put them on again soon. And in the dirt near the front door, footprints, fresh ones, made by those same boots probably this morning. Elena's senses sharpened, her breathing slowed. Her eyes moved in the systematic pattern she had been trained to use when entering an unknown space, scanning for threats, for anomalies, for anything that didn't belong. But the only thing that didn't belong here was her. Coda had reached the cabin door, and there on the worn wooden porch, the dog did something Elena had never seen him do. He sat down. Not the trained sit of a military working dog awaiting a command. Something different, something softer. He sat the way a dog sits at the door of a house. It knows a house it has returned to after a long, long time away. His body relaxed. His ears dropped from their alert position. His tail rested on the wood. He was waiting. Elena climbed the 2 steps to the porch. The boards creaked under her weight. She stood beside Coda and looked at the door. It was solid wood, old and thick, with a simple iron latch. She raised her fist and knocked. The sound echoed once and disappeared into the forest. For several seconds, nothing happened. The smoke continued to rise from the chimney. The stream murmured in the distance. Then she heard movement inside. Slow, careful. The sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. Footsteps approaching the door with the deliberate pace of someone who was not expecting visitors and was not sure they wanted any. The door opened just a few inches. Through the narrow gap, Elena saw a face. An old man, 75, maybe older. His hair was completely white, thick, and uncombed, falling past his ears. His skin was deeply lined, weathered by decades of sun and wind and cold. The kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains around them. His frame was thin but not frail. There was still strength in his shoulders in the way he held the door. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were sharp, clear, the pale blue of glacier ice. And they were looking at her with an expression that was equal parts suspicion and something harder to name. Not fear exactly, more like the wariness of a man who had been alone for so long that another human face felt like an intrusion from a world he had deliberately left behind. The two of them stared at each other through the narrow gap in the door. Elena opened her mouth to speak, explained to offer some reasonable account of why a strange woman and a dog had appeared on his doorstep in the middle of nowhere. But she never got the chance, because the old man's gaze had shifted downward, away from Elena's face, past her shoulders to the dog sitting quietly on his porch. And in that instant, everything about him changed. His hand still gripping the edge of the door began to tremble. Not from cold, not from age, from something far deeper. His lips parted slightly. The suspicion in his eyes dissolved, replaced by something raw and unguarded. Something that looked like it had been locked away for a very long time and had just broken free. The door swung open. The old man stepped forward onto the porch. He moved slowly, as if the air itself had become heavy, as if each step required him to push through years of accumulated weight. His eyes never left the dog. And then in a voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the wind, he spoke. Scout. Elena blinked. Coda did not move. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply sat there, looking up at the old man with an expression that Elena had never seen on his face before. Still, calm, certain. The old man lowered himself slowly to his knees. His hands were shaking badly now. He reached toward the dog's face with the trembling fingers of someone reaching for something they had believed was lost forever. Scout, he said again, you came back. And Coda, the dog who obeyed no one but Elena, the dog who had been trained to remain alert and guarded in the presence of strangers, gently leaned forward and rested his head against the old man's chest. The old man closed his eyes. His shoulders shook. His arms wrapped around the dog's neck, and he held on the way a man holds on to the last thing keeping him from falling. Elena stood on the porch, unable to move, unable to speak, watching a reunion she did not understand between a dog she thought she knew and a man she had never seen before. The mountain was silent around them. And somewhere deep inside her chest, in a place she had sealed shut a long time ago, something cracked. The old man held the dog for a long time. Elena didn't interrupt. She stood on the porch with her arms at her sides, watching the scene unfold with the quiet bewilderment of someone who has walked through a door and found themselves in a room that doesn't match the house. The man's face was buried in the dog's neck. His breathing was ragged, broken, the kind of breathing that comes when the body tries to process years of grief in a single moment. Coda, her Coda the dog, who flinched when strangers approached, who growled low in his throat when anyone moved too quickly and his space was perfectly still. His eyes were half closed. His body was relaxed against the old man's chest in a way Elena had never seen before. It was the posture of absolute trust, of recognition, of homecoming. Finally, the old man lifted his head. His eyes were red. His cheeks were wet. He looked up at Elena as though he had forgotten she was there. You found him, he said. Elena shook her head slowly. Sir, this is my dog. His name is Coda. He's been with me for 3 years. The old man's hand moved gently along the dog's right ear. His thumb traced a line just above the ear canal where the fur was interrupted by a thin, pale scar. This scar, he said quietly, he got it pulling a hiker out of a ravine near Glacier Point, spring of 2018. The rock shifted and caught him across the ear. I stitched it myself. Elena felt the ground beneath her shift. Not physically, something else. Something in the architecture of what she understood to be true. His name was Scout, the old man said. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't angry. He was stating a fact the way a man states his own name, with the simple certainty of someone who has lived inside that truth for years. He rose slowly to his feet, one hand still resting on the dog's head. Then he turned and pointed to the cabin wall beside the door. Elena followed his gesture. Mounted on the weathered wood was a photograph in an old frame. The glass was foggy with age. The image behind it was faded, but the subjects were clear enough. A younger version of the man standing beside her, maybe late 60s, strong-jawed and lean, wearing a red search and rescue jacket. Beside him, sitting in the same calm, certain posture that Coda held right now, was a German shepherd. The same markings, the same dark saddle pattern across the back, the same intelligent, watchful eyes, and the same pale scar above the right ear. Elena stared at the photograph. Then she looked down at Coda, then back at the photograph. "That's not possible," she said, but the words had no conviction. The old man lowered himself into a wooden chair on the porch, moving with the careful economy of a man who had learned to conserve his remaining strength for the things that mattered. He gestured to the other chair, a simple handmade thing, rough-cut pine sturdy enough. Elena sat. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fog moved through the canyon below like a slow river. The smoke from the chimney rose in a thin, straight line. Coda lay between them on the porch, his head resting on his paws, his eyes moving from one face to the other as if he understood exactly what was happening and was waiting patiently for the humans to catch up. The old man's name was Silas Drummond. He said it the way people say things they haven't said out loud in a long time, carefully, as if testing whether the words still worked. For over 2 decades, Silas had led the Flathead County Mountain Rescue Team. He told Elena this without pride, without nostalgia, just the flat delivery of facts arranged in chronological order. He had joined the team as a young man drawn to the mountains, the way some people are drawn to the sea, not for adventure, but for the feeling of being small against something immense and indifferent. He rose through the ranks steadily. By his 40s, he was leading operations. Over the years, he had participated in more than 300 rescues, lost hikers, stranded climbers, hunters caught in storms, skiers buried under avalanches. He had pulled people from places no helicopter could reach and carried them down through conditions that should have killed everyone involved. Scout had been his partner for the last 4 of those years. He found the dog at a shelter in Kalispell. A young German shepherd, barely 2 years old, surrendered by an owner who couldn't handle the animal's energy. Silas saw something in the dog the first time he visited: an intensity, a focus, a willingness to work that went beyond obedience. He brought Scout home and began training him for search and rescue. The dog was extraordinary. Within a year, Scout could track a human scent across 12 miles of mountain terrain. He could navigate avalanche debris, detect a buried body under 6 feet of snow, and maintain focus in conditions that rattled even the most experienced rescue dogs. But more than his skill, it was his temperament that made him remarkable. Scout was calm under pressure. He didn't panic, he didn't hesitate, and he had a sensitivity to human distress that Silas had never seen in another animal. The dog could find a lost child in the dark, in the rain, in the screaming chaos of a mountain storm, and when he found them, he would lie beside them and press his body against theirs until help arrived. Not because he was trained to, because something in him understood that presence, the simple act of being there, was sometimes the only rescue that mattered. They worked together for 4 years. Hundreds of calls, dozens of lives saved. The bond between them grew into something that Silas had never experienced with another human being, a partnership built on absolute trust, forged in the worst conditions nature could produce. Then came the night of November 14th. Silas paused when he reached this part of the story. He looked out at the fog as if the memory were somewhere inside it waiting. A boy, 10 years old, Nolan Pratt, son of a local rancher. The boy had gone hiking with friends after school, a trail they'd walked many times. But a storm came in faster than anyone predicted. His friends turned back. Nolan didn't. By the time his parents called the rescue team, the temperature had dropped to 15 below. Winds were gusting past 50 miles an hour. Snow was falling so thick you couldn't see your own feet. Silas and Scout deployed immediately. Just the two of them at first, because the rest of the team was 40 minutes behind, and 40 minutes in those conditions could mean the difference between a living child and a frozen one. They tracked the boy's scent up the North Ridge. Scout moved through the blizzard with terrifying certainty, never hesitating, never losing the trail. Silas followed his headlamp, cutting a weak cone of light through the white wall of snow, trusting the dog completely because there was nothing else to trust. They found Nolan 2 hours later. He was wedged into a narrow crack between two boulders, semi-conscious, hypothermic, his lips blue and his fingers white. Scout had reached him first, lying across the boy's body to share warmth, just as he always did. Silas pulled the boy free, wrapped him in an emergency blanket, radioed for extraction. Then he turned to call Scout. The sound came first, a deep, low rumble from somewhere above them. Then a crack sharp as a rifle shot echoing across the ridge. Avalanche. The wall of snow hit the ridge 60 yards above their position. Silas grabbed the boy and ran. There was no time to think, no time to calculate. He held Nolan against his chest and threw himself sideways behind a rock outcropping, covering the child with his body as the snow roared past. When the noise stopped and the world became stillhagen, Silas dug himself out with one arm, the other still wrapped around the unconscious boy. The air was thick with suspended ice. The trail behind them had disappeared under 4 feet of fresh snow. And Scout was gone. Silas searched for 6 hours. He carried the boy to the extraction point, handed him to the medical team, then turned around and went back into the storm. He dug with his hands until his gloves tore and his fingers bled. He called Scout's name until his voice broke. The rest of the rescue team found him at dawn, kneeling in the snow, still digging. They pulled him away. They told him the dog was buried, that the debris field was too large, too unstable, that continuing the search would risk more lives. Silas went back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for 3 weeks until the county ordered him to stop. They never found a body. Silas stopped talking. The silence settled over the porch like snowfall. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands clasped between her knees. She could feel the man's grief as a physical thing, dense and heavy, filling the space between them. She understood something about this story that a civilian never would. The decision Silas had made that night, grabbing the boy instead of it wasn't a choice between two options. It was the kind of decision that combat forces on you, the kind where every possible action costs something irreplaceable, and you have to choose in a fraction of a second which loss you can survive carrying for the rest of your life. Silas had chosen to save the child. It was the right choice, the only choice, and it had destroyed him. Elena knew because she had made the same kind of choice, different circumstances, different terrain, but the same impossible arithmetic of deciding who lives and who gets left behind. She looked down at Coda. The dog was watching Silas with an expression that was almost human in its patience. After he disappeared, Elena said slowly, they found him wandering near a highway. No collar, no identification. He was taken into a civilian program, then transferred to military K-9 training. Silas nodded. He didn't seem surprised. More like a man who has spent years constructing a theory and has finally heard it confirmed. He walked out of those mountains, Silas said. I always believed he did. Everyone told me he was dead, buried under tons of snow. But I knew dogs like him don't just disappear. He paused. They find their way. Elena pressed her palms flat against her knees to steady herself. Why are you here? She asked. She didn't mean the cabin. She meant the isolation. The years of solitude, the deliberate disappearance from the world. Silas didn't answer immediately. He picked at a splinter on the arm of his chair, working it loose with his thumbnail, his eyes fixed on the small task as if it required his full concentration. Then he spoke. After I lost Scout, I went back to work, told myself I could keep going, that it was just that the mission was what mattered. He shook his head slowly, but something was broken. I couldn't focus. I second-guessed every decision. Every time we deployed, I hesitated just a half second, but in rescue work, a half second is everything. He let the silence hold for a moment. 7 months later, we got a call. A climber stranded on a ledge near Logan Pass. Bad weather coming in. Standard extraction. I'd done it 100 times. His voice dropped. The climber fell. I was late setting the anchor. Half a second. That's all it was. Half a second of hesitation and a man fell 80 feet onto rock. Elena didn't move. He died on the way to the hospital, 34 years old, had a wife, a daughter. Silas looked at his hands. After the investigation, they let me go. Officially, it was medical retirement. Unofficially, everyone knew. The county didn't want a rescue leader whose hands shook every time he heard a storm warning. He paused. My wife tried to stay. Ruth was a strong woman, but you can't share a life with someone who's already left it. She moved to Bozeman. I stopped calling. She stopped trying. He looked out at the canyon. I found this place the following spring, built the fence, fixed the roof, started the garden, and I told myself that staying here was the responsible thing to do, that a man who gets people killed shouldn't be around people. He turned to Elena. But that's not why I stayed, not really. Elena waited. I stayed because it was easier than going back, easier than explaining, easier than sitting across from someone and watching them try to understand something they never will. The words hit Elena like a hand against her sternum. Not because they were harsh, because they were exact. They were the precise words she would have used to describe her own life, her own cabin, her own decision to disappear into the mountains rather than face the world she had failed to hold together. She saw it clearly now. Silas Drummond was not a stranger. He was a mirror, a version of herself projected forward by decades. A man who had made the same choice she was making, the choice to let guilt and shame build walls so high that nothing could get through, not even the people who still needed him. Do you have kids? Elena asked. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A daughter, Catherine. She was 26 when I came out here. She's 32 now. Does she know where you are? The silence that followed was the loudest sound Elena had ever heard. No. One word, 6 years of absence compressed into a single syllable. Elena looked at the fog. She thought about Wren, 8 years old, missing tooth smile. Bright eyes searching for something in her mother's face that her mother couldn't give her. 10 days. And then Silas asked the question she had been avoiding since the moment she sat down. What about you? Elena's hands tightened on her knees. What about me? A woman doesn't follow a dog into a canyon for no reason. You're not a hiker who stumbled off the trail. You moved down that cliff face like someone who's been trained to move in hostile terrain. He studied her, and you've got the same look I had when I first came out here. The look of someone who's already decided that the world is better off without them in it. Elena said nothing. So what are you running from? The question hung in the cold air between them. Below them the stream whispered. Above them the fog shifted and thinned for a moment, letting a single beam of pale sunlight cut through the canopy before closing again. Elena could have deflected. She could have given him the short version, the clinical version, the version she had given V, a therapists and custody evaluators, and the handful of people who had asked. PTSD, adjustment difficulties. A marriage that didn't survive reintegration, but something about this place, this man, this impossible morning made those rehearsed answers feel like lies. I have a daughter, she said. Her name is Wren. She's 8. She stopped, then continued. I lost custody 18 months ago. I was supposed to have visitation, but I stopped going. I told myself I'd go next time. I told myself I'd be better by then. She stared at the porch floor. I got a call this morning. Her father wants to terminate my visitation rights completely. I have 10 days to file an objection. And I turned off the phone and went for a walk. Silas nodded slowly, not in judgment, in recognition. You think she's better off without you, he said. It wasn't a question. Elena's throat constricted. She pressed her lips together hard. She would not cry. She had not cried since the day she learned her father had been buried without her, and she would not start now. Not here, not in front of a stranger on a porch in the middle of nowhere. But Silas wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Coda. The dog had risen from his spot between the chairs and moved to Elena's side. He pressed his head against her knee, firm and warm, and stayed there. I thought the same thing, Silas said quietly. About Catherine. I told myself she was better off forgetting me. That a father who couldn't save his own dog, who got a man killed because his hands wouldn't stop shaking, had no business being in anyone's life. He looked at Elena. I've been telling myself that for 6 years, and not once has it felt true. The sun broke through the fog again just for a moment. The canyon below them flickered with gold, the stream catching the light and scattering it across the rocks. Then the clouds closed and the gray returned. Elena sat with her hand on Coda's head. The dog who had walked out of an avalanche and across the state, who had been given a new name and sent to war and brought to a cabin in the mountains, and who this morning had climbed a ridge he shouldn't have known, found a path no one could see, and led her here. She thought about Wren somewhere far away, growing up without understanding why her mother had disappeared. She thought about 10 days, and for the first time in 22 months, something stirred beneath the numbness. Something small, something stubborn, something that refused to lie down. That night, a fire burned in the cabin's stone hearth. The space inside was smaller than Elena had expected. One room mostly, a narrow cot pushed against the far wall covered in wool blankets that had been mended many times. A shelf of books water-stained and swollen, their spines cracked from rereading. A cast iron stove in the corner beside a modest stack of dry goods, canned beans, rice, powdered milk, the provisions of a man who had reduced his needs to the barest minimum. Everything in the cabin had been repaired at least once. The chair legs were wrapped with wire. The table had been sanded down and refinished until the grain was almost white. Even the walls, rough-hewn logs sealed with mud and moss, showed the patient evidence of maintenance performed by hands that had nothing but time. It was the home of a man who had stopped living but refused to stop surviving. Elena sat in the chair beside the hearth, her boots drying near the fire, her jacket hung on a peg by the door. Coda lay on the floor between her and Silas. His body stretched out, his eyes half open, watching the flames with the deep contentment of an animal who has finally found the place where all his ghosts are quiet. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee from a dented percolator. The coffee was strong and bitter and tasted like it had been brewed the same way for years. He handed one to Elena without ceremony and settled into the chair across from her. For a while they drank in silence. The fire popped. The wind moved outside, pressing against the cabin walls, testing the seams. The world beyond the small windows was completely dark. Then Silas spoke. "The photograph in your pocket, the girl." Elena's hand moved instinctively toward her jacket on the peg, then stopped. "Wren," she said, "tell me about her." Elena stared into the fire. The question should have been easy. Mothers were supposed to be able to talk about their children the way rivers talk about the sea, naturally, endlessly, with force that doesn't require thought. But the words had been locked away for so long that pulling them out felt like pulling nails from old wood. "She draws," Elena said finally, "constantly, on everything. Napkins, paper bags, the margins of her homework. Mostly animals. She's obsessed with wolves. When she was 6, she told me she wanted to be a wolf biologist and live in Yellowstone." A faint smile crossed her face. It disappeared almost immediately. "She has this laugh, this ridiculous, uncontrolled laugh that takes over her entire body. She laughs with her shoulders and her stomach and her feet. I used to be able to make her laugh like that just by making a certain face." Lena paused. "I don't know if I still can." Silas watched her. "The last time I saw her, she asked me why I was shaking. I told her I was cold." Elena's voice dropped. She knew I was lying. 8 years old and she knew. Kids always know. She set the coffee cup down on the floor beside her chair. "I stopped going because I was afraid, not of the drive or the crowds or the noise. I was afraid she would look at me and see what I see. A mother who is broken. A mother who can't hold herself together long enough to sit in a park for 2 hours. And I thought if she sees that, if she really sees it, she'll carry it. The way I carried my father's silence. The way children carry the damage their parents can't hide." Her jaw tightened. "So I convinced myself that disappearing was the kind thing to do. That absence was better than the truth." The fire shifted, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. Coda lifted his head briefly, then settled again. Silas was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, rougher, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep and resistant. "Catherine was 26 when I left," he said. "She had just started working in emergency medicine, trauma care." He paused. "She got that for, I think, the need to help, the need to be the one who shows up when everything goes wrong." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "When I came out here, I told myself it was temporary. a few months to clear my head. I even told Catherine that. I said I needed time. She understood. She was patient. She called every week at first, left messages on my voicemail, then every 2 weeks, then once a month. His thumb traced the rim of the cup. I never called back. Not once. I told myself I would. Tomorrow, next week, after I figured things out. But the truth was, every time I heard her voice, I heard the thing she wasn't saying. That she needed me. That she was waiting for me to come back. And I couldn't face that because coming back meant being the man she believed I was, and I didn't believe I was that man anymore. He set the cup down. The calls stopped after the second year. I don't know exactly when. I just noticed one day that the phone hadn't rung in a long time. And I realized that the silence I had chosen had finally chosen me back. Elena watched his face in the firelight, the lines around his eyes, the way his mouth settled into a shape that suggested it had forgotten how to form certain expressions, smiling maybe, or the particular arrangement of muscles required to say the word sorry and mean it. "What was your biggest mistake?" she asked. "Losing Scout, the climber." Silas shook his head slowly. "No, those were tragedies, terrible ones. But they happened to me. I didn't choose them." He looked directly at Elena. "The mistake I chose was letting the shame build walls between me and the people who were still alive. I lost Scout in a blizzard. I lost that climber on a cliff. But I lost Catherine in a cabin with a working telephone and a door I could have opened any day for 6 years." The words settled into the room like stones dropped into still water. Elena felt them land. She felt them sink through the surface of every defense she had built, every justification she had constructed, every careful argument she had made to herself about why staying away was the responsible thing to do. Because Silas wasn't describing his failure. He was describing hers. In different words, with different names, but the architecture was identical. The shame, the walls, the telephone that never rang because neither of them could bear to pick it up. She looked at Coda asleep on the floor. The dog who had never stopped searching, never stopped moving, never decided that the distance was too great or the time too long. And she thought about Wren drawing wolves on napkins, laughing with her whole body, asking her mother why she was shaking, waiting. Elena stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. Coda's head lifted. "I have to go back," she said. Silas looked at her. "Not to the cabin. Back. I need to call my attorney. I need to file the objection. I need to fight this." She said the words and felt something break open inside her chest, not painfully, but the way ice breaks on a river in spring, a necessary fracture that allows the current to move again. "I stopped fighting 18 months ago," she said. "I told myself it was because I couldn't. But that was a lie. I stopped because fighting meant showing up. And showing up meant letting people see me. And I was too afraid of what they'd see." She looked at Silas. "I'm still afraid, but I have 10 days, and I am not going to spend them sitting in an empty cabin while my daughter learns to live without me." Silas nodded. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker, a small light in a long darkened room. "Good," he said quietly. Elena pulled her jacket from the peg and put it on. Then she stopped. She turned back to the old man sitting by the fire in the cabin he had built to hide in, surrounded by 6 years of silence and repaired furniture and a garden that no one but him would ever see. "Come with me," she said. Silas blinked. "Out of here. Off this mountain. Back to the world." He shook his head immediately, the reflex of a man who had rehearsed this refusal so many times it had become automatic. I can't do that. Why not? Because there's nothing left for me out there. I've been gone too long. Catherine has moved on. Ruth has moved on. The world has moved on. You don't know that. I know enough. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Coda lying on the floor between them, the dog with two names, the dog who had walked out of a blizzard, been picked up on a highway, thrown into a training program, given a new name, sent to war, and somehow on an ordinary morning in Montana, led a stranger to the one porch in the world where he had last been whole. If he doesn't get to quit, Elena said, neither do you. The cabin was silent. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls, steady and patient, the way it had pushed against them for years. Silas looked at Coda. The dog looked back at him with those deep, calm eyes that had seen blizzards and battlefields, and the inside of a dozen different lives, and through all of it had never lost the memory of where he started. The old man's hands were trembling again. But this time it wasn't grief. He stood up. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He crossed the cabin, slowly opened a wooden trunk beneath the window, and pulled out a jacket. It was old, faded red, the kind of jacket worn by search and rescue teams. He held it for a moment, running his thumb over the patches on the shoulder, reading the embroidered name with his fingertips, like a man reading something sacred. Then he put it on. They left the cabin at first light. The morning was cold and clear, the first morning in days without heavy fog. The canyon below was still in shadow, but above the ridge line the sky had opened into a pale, endless blue. Elena led the way up the narrow path they had descended the day before. Silas followed slower but steady, one hand bracing against the rock, the other occasionally reaching down to touch Coda's back as the dog moved beside him. The climb was harder going up. Every step required deliberate effort. The loose stone that had slid beneath Elena's boots on the way down now required careful navigation in reverse, finding edges to grip footholds that would hold weight. Silas moved with the methodical patience of a man who had spent decades in mountain terrain, reading the rock, choosing his path, never rushing. Coda moved between them, back and forth, checking on Elena when she climbed ahead, returning to Silas when the old man paused to catch his breath. The dog was a thread connecting them, weaving up the cliff face, binding two people together who had been strangers 24 hours ago and were now something else entirely. Halfway up, Silas stopped. He leaned against a flat section of rock, breathing hard, and looked back down at the canyon. The cabin was visible below, small and dark among the trees. The thin line of the stream, the garden, the porch where he had knelt and held his took and wept. Elena stopped beside him. You all right? Silas looked at the cabin for a long moment. Then he turned his face upward toward the ridge, toward the sky, toward the world he had left behind. Not yet, he said, but I'm climbing. They reached the top an hour later. The ridge opened onto the high meadow Elena knew well. In the distance, the trail that led back to her own cabin wound through the pines. Familiar ground. But nothing about this morning felt familiar. Elena pulled her phone from her pocket and turned it on. The screen lit up slowly. 3 missed calls, 2 voicemails. A signal bar flickered and held. She dialed her attorney's number. The phone rang twice, 3 times. A voice answered. This is Elena Mercer, she said. I need to file an objection to the termination motion. I need you to tell me exactly what I have to do, and I need to start today. She listened, she nodded. She asked questions in a voice that was steady and clear, the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years making decisions under pressure and had remembered standing on a ridge in the Montana morning that she still knew how. When she hung up, she stood for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she opened the contacts list and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in over a year. Deborah. She pressed dial. The phone rang. Once, twice, three times, four. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She almost hung up. Almost. The reflex to retreat to protect herself from the sound of disappointment or anger or silence on the other end was so strong it made her hand shake. 5 rings, then a voice, confused, cautious. Elena. I need help, Elena said. 3 words. The 3 hardest words she had ever spoken. Harder than any order she had given in combat. Harder than any briefing, any debriefing, any conversation with any commanding officer in 15 years of service. 3 words that admitted she could not do this alone. There was a pause on the other end, then a breath, then a sound that might have been a small, broken laugh, or might have been something closer to relief. Okay, Deborah said, tell me what you need. 6 months later, the fog was gone, not just from the mountains. The autumn had come to western Montana in its usual blaze of gold and copper, and on this particular morning, the sky above the valley was so clear, it seemed like you could see all the way to the edge of the world. Elena Mercer stood on the ridge where it had all begun, the same cliff edge, the same jagged rock. But the woman standing there was not the same woman who had stood in the fog 6 months ago, holding a photograph and wondering if she had already disappeared. She had spent 3 months in an intensive outpatient therapy program at the VA center in Missoula. Not because a court ordered her to, though the court had required it as a condition of the custody review, but because she had walked into the intake office on her own, signed the paperwork with her own hand, and said to the counselor behind the desk the same 3 words she had spoken on the phone that morning on the ridge. The process had been brutal. Therapy is not a gentle thing when the wounds are deep and the patient has spent years building fortifications around them. There were sessions that left her so drained she couldn't drive home. There were nights when the old darkness returned and whispered that none of it was working, that she was too far gone, that the damage was permanent. But she went back, every session, every week. She went back because stopping was the only option she was no longer willing to accept. The custody review had taken 4 months. Depositions, evaluations, reports from therapists and counselors and social workers. Kyle had fought it, not out of cruelty, but out of the genuine belief that Elena was incapable of being a stable presence in their daughter's life. Elena did not blame him for that belief. She had given him every reason to hold it. But the judge had seen something in the evaluations that Kyle hadn't expected. Progress. Consistent, documented, hard-won progress. And in the end, the court restored supervised visitation with a clear pathway to unsupervised contact within 6 months if Elena continued treatment. The first visit had been in September. Elena had driven to the park in Billings, where she used to meet Ren. She arrived 30 minutes early and sat in her truck with her hands on the steering wheel, breathing, counting, running through the grounding exercises her therapist had taught her. When Kyle's car pulled into the lot and the back door opened and a small figure climbed out, Elena's vision blurred and her chest seized, and for one terrible moment she thought she couldn't do it. Then Ren looked up, across the parking lot, across 18 months of silence and absence, and unanswered questions. And she smiled. Not the cautious, searching smile of a child meeting a stranger. The full, unguarded, whole-body smile of a daughter who had been waiting. Elena got out of the truck and walked across the parking lot and knelt on the asphalt and held her daughter so tightly that the world reduced to two heartbeats, and the smell of grape juice and sunscreen and the impossibly soft hair of a child who had never stopped believing her mother would come back. Now standing on the ridge in the October morning, Elena watched the valley below fill with golden light. Beside her, Wren sat on a flat rock, set safely back from the edge, a sketchbook open on her lap. She was drawing the valley, the trees, the winding silver line of the creek below, with the focused intensity of a child who sees the world as a series of beautiful problems waiting to be captured on paper. Behind them, sitting in a canvas camp chair he had carried up the trail himself, was Silas Drummond. He looked different now, still thin, still weathered, still carrying the quiet gravity of a man who has lived through things that most people cannot imagine. But the isolation had left him. It had been replaced by something else, not quite peace, but something adjacent to it. The particular calm of a man who has stopped running and discovered that the thing chasing him was not as large as he had feared. Silas had moved into the spare room of Elena's cabin 4 months ago. The arrangement had no name and needed none. He was not a father, he was not a guest. He was something the English language doesn't have a precise word for, a man who arrived at the exact moment he was needed, whose presence filled a space that no one else could have filled, and who, in the process of helping someone else find their way back, had found his own. He had called Catherine in August. Elena had been there when he dialed. She watched his hands shake as the phone rang. She watched his face when his daughter answered. She stood in the doorway and listened as a 75-year-old man said to his 32-year-old daughter the words he should have said 6 years ago, that he was sorry, that he had been wrong, that he was still here. Catherine had driven from Bozeman the following weekend. Coda lay between them all on the ridge, his head resting on his paws, his body positioned so that he could see Elena and Silas and Wren at the same time. The dog who had walked through the wilderness, who had answered to two names and lived two lives, who had never stopped moving toward the place where he was whole. A sound from below caught Elena's attention. She looked down the trail. A figure was climbing toward them. Young, maybe 16, lean and deliberate in his movements, carrying a backpack and wearing hiking boots that had seen serious use. Silas saw him too. He leaned forward in his chair. The young man reached the ridge. He stopped a few feet away, breathing hard from the climb, and looked at Silas with an expression that was hard to read at first. Nervousness, maybe, or the look of someone who has rehearsed a moment in their mind 1,000 times and is now discovering that reality feels nothing like the rehearsal. "Mr. Drummond," Silas stood slowly. "My name is Nolan Pratt." Silas didn't move. His face was very still. The name hung in the mountain air like the echo of something that happened a long time ago in a snowstorm on a ridge not far from where they were standing. "I was 10 years old," the young man said. "November 14th. My friends turned back and I didn't. You came for me in the storm, you and your dog." He paused. "I've been looking for you for over a year. A woman at the county rescue office told me you'd disappeared into the mountains. I'd almost given up. Then I saw a piece in the local paper about a veteran hiking program being run out of a cabin in the Flathead Valley, and the man in the photograph looked like someone I've been carrying in my memory since I was 10 years old." Silas's hands were trembling. "I came here to say something I should have said a long time ago. The young man's voice broke slightly. He steadied himself. Thank you for coming into that storm, for choosing to carry me out. I know what it cost you. I know about Scout. I know about all of it. And I need you to know that I have thought about that night every single day of my life. And that everything I've done every morning I've woken up, it's because of you. Silas Drummond looked at the young man who had once been a 10-year-old boy dying in the snow, the boy he had chosen to save, the choice that had cost him everything and given him nothing in return until this moment standing on a mountain 6 years later, hearing the one sentence that had the power to rewrite the meaning of the worst night of his life. He reached out and took the young man's hand. He held it with both of his own, the way you hold something precious that has been returned to you after you were certain it was gone. He didn't speak. There were no words for this. Some debts can only be acknowledged in silence, and some payments arrive so late that receiving them feels like a kind of miracle. Wren looked up from her sketchbook and watched the two of them with the quiet attention of a child who doesn't fully understand what she is seeing but knows in the way children know that it is important. Elena stood beside her daughter and rested a hand on her shoulder. Below them the valley spread out in every direction, golden and vast and clear. No fog, no mist, no gray curtain hiding what lay ahead. Just the land, open and patient, waiting for whoever was willing to walk it. Coda rose from his spot on the rock. He stretched, yawned, and padded over to Wren, pressing his nose against her hand until she giggled and scratched behind his ears. Then he circled once the way dogs do when they are finding their place and laid down beside the girl, his head resting on his paws, his dark eyes calm. The morning light moved across the mountains. The creek below caught the sun and scattered it into 1,000 bright points. Somewhere in the trees a bird sang 3 notes and went quiet as if it had said everything it needed to say. And on the ridge where Elena Mercer had once stood in the fog wondering if she had already vanished from the world, 4 people and a dog sat together in the light, learning the only lesson that mattered, that the longest roads don't always lead away. Sometimes they circle back. Sometimes the path you thought was taking you further from everything you lost was quietly, stubbornly, faithfully leading you home. And sometimes the ones who guide you there aren't the ones who speak the loudest. They're the ones who never left your side, the ones who kept walking when you stopped, the ones who remembered the way back when you had forgotten there was anything worth returning to. The ones who followed you into the fog and waited with a patience that outlasts everything for you to be ready to step into the light.